28th of February, 1945. The snow fell like ash over the granite quarries of Mauthausen, a concentration camp perched above the Danube River in Upper Austria, where the chimneys never stopped smoking and the screams never truly ended. This was not merely a place of death. It was a factory of suffering, designed with architectural precision to break the human spirit before extinguishing life itself. What the guards called the Camp of No Return had earned its reputation through innovations in cruelty that would shock even the architects of the Nazi death machine. The camp's reputation preceded its physical horrors. From the moment prisoners arrived at the railway station in nearby Mauthausen village, they understood their fate. Unlike other concentration camps where the fiction of resettlement or labor might offer false hope for survival, Mauthausen announced its purpose openly. The camp was classified as Category 3 by the SS, reserved for incorrigible political enemies of the Reich who were to be worked to death. No one was meant to leave alive. The fortress-like walls rose from the hillside like a medieval castle, but this structure served a purpose far darker than any dungeon of the Middle Ages. Built beginning in August 1938, shortly after the annexation of Austria into Nazi Germany, Mauthausen was constructed to exploit the nearby granite quarries. The stone extracted here would build the monuments of Hitler's thousand-year Reich, each block stained with the blood of those who cut it. Spanish Republicans, political dissidents, resistance fighters, Soviet prisoners of war, and Jewish men, women, and children were transported here from across occupied Europe. According to documentation preserved by the Mauthausen Memorial Archives, between 160,000 and 200,000 prisoners passed through Mauthausen and its subcamps during its 7 years of operation. More than 90,000 would never leave. The camp's commandant from August 1938 to May 1939, Albert Sauer, established the brutal regime that would define Mauthausen. His successor, Franz Zierreis, who commanded from February 1939 until liberation in May 1945, perfected the systems of torture and murder that made Mauthausen unique even among Nazi death camps. What distinguished Mauthausen from other camps was not just the quantity of death, but the variety and creativity of its methods. The granite quarry became the most feared location in the entire Nazi concentration camp system, a place where murder wore the mask of labor. The SS guards developed dozens of methods to kill prisoners while maintaining the fiction of death through work, each technique more diabolical than the last. As documented in numerous historical accounts, including Barbara Distel's research published in the Journal of Holocaust Education, the mortality rate at Mauthausen exceeded even Auschwitz when measured against the duration of prisoner survival. While Auschwitz killed through industrial gassing, Mauthausen specialized in prolonged agony. The average life expectancy of a prisoner in the quarry was measured in weeks, not months. The camp operated 49 subcamps across Austria, but the main camp at Mauthausen remained the deadliest. Here, the Nazi ideology of racial superiority and political terror achieved its most concentrated expression. The stone walls held secrets that the liberators would struggle to comprehend, atrocities that defied human understanding. This was hell made real, carved into the Austrian hillside, powered by hate and administered with bureaucratic efficiency. The most infamous feature of Mauthausen stood at the heart of its quarry operations. 186 stone steps carved into the granite face, known to prisoners simply as the Stairs of Death. Each morning, thousands of prisoners descended these irregular, treacherous steps to the quarry floor below. Each evening, those who survived the day's labor would climb them again, often carrying granite blocks weighing between 30 and 50 kilograms on their backs. The stairs themselves were instruments of murder. Unlike ordinary steps, they varied wildly in height and depth, making descent hazardous and ascent nearly impossible when burdened with stone. Prisoners wore inadequate wooden clogs that slipped on the granite, especially when rain or snow made the surface lethal. The SS guards positioned themselves along the stairway, ready to push prisoners who stumbled, creating domino effects that sent dozens tumbling to their deaths on the rocks below. Louis Hefliger, a Red Cross official who witnessed the camp's final days, later testified that the stairs claimed lives daily through both accidents and calculated murder. Guards played games with prisoner lives, betting on how many would fall during a single ascent. They called it sport, this casual extermination disguised as quarry work. The quarry itself sprawled across several hectares, its walls dropping 30 meters in some places. Prisoners worked with primitive tools, extracting stone that would pave Vienna's streets and construct administrative buildings across the Reich. The granite of Mauthausen, known for its quality and durability, became a commodity built on bones. For every block that left the quarry, several prisoners died in its extraction. Testimony from survivor Stanisław Grzesiuk, a Polish poet imprisoned at Mauthausen, describes the surreal horror of the quarry, men working until they collapsed from exhaustion, only to be thrown from the cliff edge by guards who resented the disruption to productivity. The cliff became known as the parachutists' wall. SS guards would force prisoners to stand at the edge, then push them over, joking that they were parachutists as they fell to their deaths on the rocks below. The work brigades operated from dawn until dusk regardless of weather. In summer, prisoners collapsed from heat exhaustion and dehydration. In winter, they froze to death where they stood, their bodies left until the workday ended. The quarry became a landscape of corpses in various stages of death, some still moving, others already stiff, all awaiting the evening collection when trucks would haul them to the crematorium. Medical care was non-existent for quarry workers. Injuries meant death, either immediate or prolonged. A broken leg, a crushed hand, a back injury from the constant load-bearing. Any of these rendered a prisoner useless for labor, and thus designated for elimination. The camp hospital existed primarily to conduct medical experiments, not to heal. Those admitted rarely emerged alive. The SS maintained detailed records of the quarry's production, but falsified cause of death in camp records. Heart failure, pneumonia, shot while escaping. These phrases appeared thousands of times in official documents, bureaucratic euphemisms for murder. The truth lay in the quarry, where the stone itself bore witness to atrocities that the perpetrators attempted to conceal through paperwork. Survivor Simon Wiesenthal, who would become famous for hunting Nazi war criminals, spent time in Mauthausen and later described the quarry as the closest thing to Dante's Inferno that existed on Earth. The comparison was apt. This was hell organized by layers, where descent meant suffering and ascent meant death, and where hope itself was quarried away like the granite beneath prisoner feet. Block 20 at Mauthausen held a special designation in the camp's architecture of death. Known officially as the Sanitätslager, or medical quarantine camp, prisoners knew it by a simpler name, the death block. Here, those deemed too sick, too weak, or too injured to work were sent to die. Not to be healed, not to rest, but simply to die away from the sight of other prisoners who might still be exploited for labor. The conditions inside Block 20 defied description. Prisoners lay packed on wooden bunks without mattresses, often 3 or 4 to a space designed for one. No medical treatment was provided. No food worth the name arrived, only watery soup and moldy bread scraps. The sick and dying lay in their own waste as toilets were inaccessible and guards beat anyone who tried to leave the block. Dr. Eduard Krebsbach, the SS camp physician from October 1941 to August 1943, oversaw Block 20 with particular cruelty. Rather than treating patients, he used the block as a laboratory for phenol injections, direct shots to the heart that killed instantly. He personally murdered thousands of prisoners this way, selecting victims based not on medical criteria, but on whim and racial ideology. His successor, Dr. Friedrich Entress, continued these practices and expanded them. Entress arrived at Mauthausen with experience from Auschwitz, bringing with him refined techniques of medical murder. Under his supervision, Block 20 became a testing ground for various methods of killing that appeared natural or medical in documentation. The camp registry would show died of illness rather than murdered by injection. The medical experiments at Mauthausen rivaled those of Josef Mengele at Auschwitz, though they received less post-war attention. Prisoners were infected with diseases to test treatments, but the treatments were never administered. They were subjected to extreme temperatures to study hypothermia and frostbite. They were operated on without anesthesia to train SS medical students. Their suffering served ideology and curiosity in equal measure. Spanish Republican prisoners, Remnants of the Civil War who had fled to France only to be handed over to Nazi Germany filled Block 20 in disproportionate numbers. Francisco Boix, a Spanish photographer who survived Mauthausen, secretly documented the camp's atrocities with a smuggled camera. His photographs, hidden and preserved, would later serve as evidence at war crimes trials. Boix's images captured the skeletal prisoners of Block 20, their bodies reduced to bone and skin, their eyes hollow with knowledge of approaching death. The liquidation of Block 20 occurred periodically when overcrowding reached critical levels. Guards would select hundreds of prisoners for transport to another camp. These prisoners would be loaded into trucks, but instead of traveling to a railway station, the trucks would back up to the camp crematorium. The victims would be forced into the gas chamber built specially for this purpose, killed with Zyklon B, and burned within hours. According to research published in the International Journal of Holocaust Studies, Mauthausen operated a gas chamber from early 1942 onward, though on a smaller scale than the extermination camps in Poland. The gas chamber at Mauthausen was disguised as a shower room and killed several hundred prisoners at a time. Its primary victims were those from Block 20, along with prisoners whose continued existence inconvenienced the SS administration. The psychological torture of Block 20 matched its physical horrors. Prisoners could hear the crematorium ovens working constantly. They could smell burning flesh on the wind. They watched fellow prisoners disappear nightly, knowing their turn approached. Hope became a luxury no one could afford. Survival meant betrayal, accepting another day of life while surrounded by death. 16 kilometers from the main camp, deep in the Austrian forest, lay Wiener Graben, a subcamp that made even Mauthausen seem merciful by comparison. Established in June 1943, this subcamp specialized in tunnel construction for underground armament factories, part of the Nazi regime's desperate attempt to move war production beyond the reach of Allied bombers. The work at Wiener Graben involved drilling and blasting tunnels through solid rock using primitive equipment and human muscle. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts in the tunnels, breathing rock dust and explosive fumes without any protective equipment. The air was thick with silica particles that scarred lungs and caused a rapid onset of silicosis, a fatal lung disease. Most prisoners assigned to Wiener Graben died within 3 months. The camp commandant at Wiener Graben, SS Hauptsturmführer Georg Bachmeier, achieved notoriety even among SS officers for his sadism. Bachmeier personally shot prisoners who worked too slowly, using them for target practice during his rounds. He kept detailed records of his kills, treating murder as a competitive sport. Survivor testimony suggests he personally killed more than 300 prisoners during his time commanding the subcamp. Soviet prisoners of war formed the majority of Wiener Graben's population. After Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were captured. The Nazis considered these men racially inferior and politically dangerous, subjecting them to treatment that violated even the minimal protections of the Geneva Conventions. At Wiener Graben, Soviet POWs were literally worked to death in the tunnels. The tunnel system at Wiener Graben stretched for kilometers underground, a subterranean factory where V-2 rocket components and Messerschmitt fighter plane parts were manufactured by slave labor. The tunnels flooded regularly, and prisoners worked standing in ice-cold water. Dynamite explosions regularly killed workers, sometimes by design, when the SS decided to clear sections of prisoners they deemed unproductive. Food rations at Wiener Graben fell below even Mauthausen's starvation levels. Prisoners received approximately 800 calories daily, less than half the minimum required for survival at rest, much less for brutal physical labor. The camp had no hospital, no medical care whatsoever. Injury or illness meant immediate execution. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be transported to Mauthausen's crematorium, so the SS ordered mass graves dug in the surrounding forest. The liberation of Wiener Graben by the United States Army's 11th Armored Division on 5th of May, 1945, revealed horrors that shocked even battle-hardened soldiers. The tunnels contained hundreds of corpses in various stages of decomposition. The living prisoners were barely distinguishable from the dead, walking skeletons who had somehow clung to life through months or years of unspeakable suffering. Many survivors died in the days following liberation, their bodies too damaged to recover even with proper nutrition and medical care. The Wiener Graben subcamp exemplified the Nazi policy of Vernichtung durch Arbeit, extermination through labor. This policy, formalized in September 1942, aimed to extract maximum economic value from prisoners before killing them. It was slavery combined with genocide, capitalism perverted to serve mass murder. The tunnels at Wiener Graben bore witness to this policy's brutal efficiency. The autumn of 1944 brought a terrible new influx to Mauthausen. Thousands of Hungarian Jews, survivors of Auschwitz who had been selected for labor rather than immediate gassing. These prisoners arrived at Mauthausen in cattle cars, already traumatized by the selection process that had separated them from families sent directly to the gas chambers. They believed themselves fortunate to have survived Auschwitz. They had no idea they were entering an even more brutal regime. The Hungarian transports coincided with the dismantling of Auschwitz-Birkenau, as Soviet forces approached from the east. The SS began evacuating prisoners westward in death marches and railway transports, redistributing the slave labor force to camps inside the shrinking Reich. Mauthausen became a dumping ground for these evacuees, its population swelling beyond capacity. Jewish prisoners faced particularly harsh treatment at Mauthausen. While political prisoners and prisoners of war suffered terribly, Jewish prisoners occupied the lowest rung of the camp hierarchy. They received the smallest rations, the worst work assignments, the most frequent beatings. The SS made clear that Jewish lives had no value whatsoever. They were to be worked until dead, with no pretense of eventual release or survival. Among the Hungarian transports was András Lakatos, a Budapest lawyer whose detailed testimony was later published by Yad Vashem. Lakatos described his arrival at Mauthausen in November 1944. Prisoners were marched from the railway station up the hill to the camp, beaten continuously by guards with truncheons. Those who fell were shot where they lay. By the time his transport reached the camp gates, nearly 10% had been killed in the short march from the station. The Hungarian Jews were immediately assigned to the quarry, the worst possible work detail. Few had any experience with physical labor of this intensity. Teachers, merchants, professionals, religious scholars, they found themselves carrying granite blocks up the stairs of death, dying by dozens daily. The SS viewed their deaths with indifference or amusement. Each death was one less mouth to feed, one less burden on the collapsing Reich. Winter brought additional horrors. The barracks were unheated and overcrowded, with prisoners sleeping in shifts because there was insufficient floor space for everyone to lie down simultaneously. Frost covered the inside walls. Prisoners froze to death in their sleep. In the morning, the dead would be stacked outside like cordwood, awaiting transport to the crematorium. The living envied them. A small number of Jewish prisoners were selected for specialist roles: tailors, carpenters, mechanics. These prisoners had slightly better chances of survival, though their positions were precarious. Any mistake, any perceived insubordination could result in immediate demotion back to the quarry, which meant death within weeks. The specialists lived in constant fear, performing their duties perfectly while watching their fellow Jews die around them. The camp resistance movement, operated primarily by Austrian and German political prisoners who had survived years in the camp system, attempted to help Jewish prisoners when possible. They smuggled extra food rations, warned of impending selections, and sabotaged work assignments to move vulnerable prisoners to safer positions. These acts of solidarity were dangerous and rare, but they saved lives. The resistance understood that while political prisoners might someday be released, Jewish prisoners faced certain death if not rescued by Allied liberation. 24 kilometers northwest of Mauthausen stood Hartheim Castle, a Renaissance chateau that had been converted into a killing center in June 1940. Officially designated as a special treatment facility, Hartheim served as the primary destination for Mauthausen prisoners selected for murder when the camp's own gas chamber was insufficient, or when the SS wanted to maintain the fiction that prisoners were being transferred for medical treatment. Hartheim operated under the cover of the T4 euthanasia program, the Nazi campaign to murder disabled Germans deemed life unworthy of life. When that program officially ended in August 1941 due to public protests, Hartheim secretly continued operations, expanding its mission to include concentration camp prisoners. Between January 1940 and December 1944, approximately 30,000 people were murdered at Hartheim, including approximately 18,000 prisoners from Mauthausen and its subcamps. The procedure at Hartheim was efficient and deceptive. Prisoners selected at Mauthausen would be loaded onto buses marked with Red Cross symbols. They were told they were being transported to a rest facility or hospital. The drive to Hartheim took approximately 45 minutes. Upon arrival, prisoners were led into a room and instructed to undress for medical examination. They were then led into an adjacent chamber disguised as a shower room. Rudolf Lonauer served as the medical director at Hartheim, overseeing the killing operations with bureaucratic precision. Lonauer, a psychiatrist by training, applied his medical knowledge to murder. The gas chamber at Hartheim used carbon monoxide piped in from modified automobile engines. Death occurred within 10 to 15 minutes. Bodies were immediately transported to the crematorium, which operated continuously. Personal effects and gold dental fillings were removed and sorted for return to the Reich. The selection process at Mauthausen for Hartheim transport followed crude criteria. Prisoners who were sick, injured, or deemed insufficiently productive were marked for special treatment, a euphemism that every prisoner understood meant death. The SS doctors conducting these selections made their decisions in minutes, sometimes seconds. A glance, a cursory examination, a check of production records, and the prisoner's fate was sealed. Testimony from Franz Zierreis, the Mauthausen commandant captured after liberation, revealed the administrative relationships between Mauthausen and Hartheim. Zierreis, dying from gunshot wounds while being interrogated, confessed that he had sent approximately 25,000 prisoners to Hartheim between 1940 and 1944. He described the arrangement as a convenience. Hartheim could handle larger groups and had superior crematorium capacity, reducing the burden on Mauthausen's facilities. The staff at Hartheim consisted of approximately 50 SS personnel and medical professionals who had volunteered for this duty. Many had previously worked in the T4 euthanasia program, developing expertise in mass murder disguised as medical procedure. They received extra rations and bonuses for this work, which the Nazi bureaucracy classified as especially stressful and deserving of compensation. They were being rewarded for murder. Local residents near Hartheim were aware of the castle's purpose. The smoke from the crematorium was visible for kilometers. The smell of burning flesh pervaded the countryside on still days. Yet no one protested publicly. Some locals even accepted employment at the facility, working in administration or maintenance roles. The killing continued with the tacit complicity of the community. In December 1944, as Allied forces closed in and defeat became inevitable, the SS began destroying evidence at Hartheim. Documents were burned, equipment dismantled, and the gas chamber demolished. Approximately 50 prisoners from Mauthausen were brought to Hartheim specifically to perform this destruction work. When the work was completed, all 50 were murdered to eliminate witnesses. The SS attempted to erase Hartheim's existence, but enough evidence survived to document its crimes. 3rd of May, 1945. The 11th Armored Division of the United States Army's 3rd Corps approached Mauthausen with no clear idea of what they would find. They had liberated smaller camps in recent weeks and had seen the horrors of Nazi atrocities. Nothing prepared them for Mauthausen. The camp held approximately 18,000 prisoners at liberation, but another 15,000 had died in the final weeks of the war, as the SS accelerated killings to eliminate witnesses. The SS guards began abandoning Mauthausen on 1st of May, as American forces drew near. Commandant Franz Zierreis fled south, attempting to reach the Alps and disappear among the mountains. A skeleton crew of guards remained to maintain order and destroy evidence. They burned documents, demolished the gas chamber, and attempted to conceal the crematorium. Their efforts were futile. The scale of death at Mauthausen could not be hidden. Into this chaos stepped the prisoners themselves, organizing to prevent last-minute massacres. The camp resistance, led by Austrian political prisoners with years of experience navigating SS brutality, took control of internal camp operations. They prevented guards from initiating final killing sprees, negotiated the peaceful departure of remaining SS personnel, and maintained order among the starving, traumatized prisoner population. Francisco Boix, the Spanish photographer, played a crucial role during these final days. Boix had been assigned to the camp's photographic laboratory, where he processed SS documentation photographs. For months, he had secretly made duplicate prints of images showing camp atrocities and smuggled them out of the camp with the help of civilian workers. These photographs documented executions, torture, starvation, and the visits of high-ranking Nazi officials who inspected the camp's operations. As liberation approached, Boix intensified his documentation efforts. He photographed the condition of prisoners, the piles of corpses awaiting cremation, the gas chamber before its demolition, and the quarry that had claimed so many lives. His photographs would become critical evidence at post-war trials, visual proof of crimes that defendants would attempt to deny. Boix's courage in preserving this evidence, at tremendous personal risk, ensured that the truth of Mauthausen could not be suppressed. The American soldiers who entered Mauthausen on 5th of May were hardened combat veterans, men who had fought across France and Germany. Many would later say that nothing in combat prepared them for Mauthausen. The living prisoners resembled corpses, skeletal figures who could barely move. The stench of death and decay was overwhelming. Bodies lay everywhere, in barracks, in the parade ground, stacked in storage rooms. The crematorium contained partially burned remains. The quarry held corpses at the bottom of cliffs. Military photographers and journalists accompanying the troops documented what they found. Their photographs and film footage shocked the world when released in following weeks. The images of Mauthausen, along with those from Dachau, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen, provided irrefutable visual evidence of Nazi atrocities. The camps were not rumors or propaganda, but documented reality. Medical personnel immediately began treating survivors, but many were beyond help. Thousands died in the weeks following liberation, their bodies too damaged by starvation and disease to recover. The American military established emergency hospitals, brought in food and medical supplies, and attempted to identify survivors and connect them with surviving family members. The liberation of Mauthausen marked the end of suffering for some, but for many others, the trauma would last a lifetime. Franz Sierreis, the camp commandant, was captured by American forces on 23rd of May while hiding in a hunting lodge. During his capture, he was shot 3 times. Before dying from his wounds, he gave extensive testimony about Mauthausen's operations, confessing to the murders of thousands and implicating his superiors in the Nazi hierarchy. His testimony, combined with Boix's photographs and survivor accounts, established the historical record of Mauthausen's crimes. The prosecution of Mauthausen's perpetrators began within months of liberation. The Dachau trials, conducted by the United States military between November 1945 and August 1948, included a major case focused specifically on Mauthausen. 61 defendants faced charges related to their roles at the camp, including commandants, doctors, guards, and administrators. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: survivor testimony, SS documents, and Francisco Boix's photographs. 49 defendants were convicted, with 58 receiving death sentences and 3 receiving life imprisonment. The sentences reflected the scale and brutality of crimes at Mauthausen. Among those executed were Hans Alt-Fuldisch, who had operated the gas chamber, Adolf Sutter, responsible for medical experiments, and Wilhelm Müller, who had personally murdered hundreds of prisoners. The executions were carried out at Landsberg prison between May and October 1946. However, many perpetrators escaped justice. Dozens of guards and administrators fled before liberation and successfully concealed their identities in post-war chaos. Some made their way to Spain or South America, finding refuge in countries sympathetic to fascism. Others simply blended into German and Austrian society, their crimes forgotten or ignored as Europe rebuilt. The full scale of complicity at Mauthausen, including civilian workers, local officials, and industrial beneficiaries of slave labor, was never fully prosecuted. The site of Mauthausen itself became a memorial in 1949, established by survivors and Austrian officials to preserve the physical evidence of the camp and honor the victims. The memorial includes the original barracks, the gas chamber, the crematorium, and the granite quarry with its stairs of death. The site receives approximately 200,000 visitors annually, serving as a place of education and remembrance. Francisco Boix's photographs became central to the historical documentation of Nazi crimes. After the war, Boix testified at the Nuremberg trials and at the Dachau trials, providing evidence that convicted numerous war criminals. His photographs appeared in publications worldwide, forcing the public to confront the reality of concentration camps. Boix himself struggled with trauma and poverty after the war, dying in Paris in 1951 at age 30 from kidney disease likely contracted at Mauthausen. His legacy as a photographer and witness to atrocity has been recognized through exhibitions, books, and films. The Spanish Republican survivors of Mauthausen formed organizations dedicated to preserving memory and seeking justice. More than 7,000 Spanish Republicans had been imprisoned at Mauthausen, with approximately 4,000 dying there. The survivors created the Amicale de Mauthausen in France, documenting the experiences of Spanish prisoners and advocating for recognition of their suffering. Their testimony emphasized that Mauthausen's victims included not only Jews, but political opponents of fascism from across Europe. Academic research into Mauthausen continues to reveal new information about the camp's operations and the network of complicity that enabled its crimes. The Mauthausen Memorial Archives contain over 200,000 documents, including SS records, prisoner testimonies, and post-war investigations. Historians have traced the fate of individual prisoners, documented the economic exploitation of slave labor, and analyzed the bureaucratic systems that administered mass murder. The legacy of Mauthausen extends beyond historical documentation to moral questions about human nature, institutional evil, and the responsibilities of bystanders. How could ordinary men become mass murderers? How could a society permit such atrocities? What obligations do survivors in subsequent generations bear to remember and prevent recurrence? These questions remain urgent decades after liberation. The granite quarried at Mauthausen paves streets across Austria and decorates buildings throughout Vienna. Every stone extracted before May 1945 represents prisoners who died cutting it. These physical remnants of Mauthausen persist in the built environment, silent witnesses to crimes that society has struggled to acknowledge fully. The stone itself serves as a memorial, carrying the weight of history in its very substance. Mauthausen represents a particular form of Nazi evil, not the industrial murder of Auschwitz, but the personalized cruelty of guards who knew their victims, the systematic torture disguised as labor, the architectural integration of death into every aspect of camp design. It stands as evidence that the Holocaust encompassed many methods of murder, each adapted to local circumstances and perpetrator preferences. The liberation of Mauthausen 79 years ago revealed truths about human cruelty that demand continued remembrance. The victim's suffering must not be forgotten. The perpetrator's crimes must not be excused. The systems that enabled Mauthausen must be understood so they can never be rebuilt. In memory lies responsibility, to the dead, to survivors, and to future generations who must ensure that never again means never again.